Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. We're recording this on Tuesday, April 19th. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. Aware was established 14 years ago after the counterattacks in New York and Washington of 9/11-2001. The founders of Aware were citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use the 9/11 crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. And so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. That control benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%, and not Americans in general, who've seen wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands over more than a generation. The U.S. wars are not in the news. The presidential candidates are a distraction while the U.S. government continues to kill people around the world. And it seems clear that Hillary Clinton, as president, would continue the pro-war and pro-Wall Street policies of the Obama and Bush administrations. Whatever else one may think about Donald Trump as a presidential candidate, his foreign policy views should be welcomed for their challenge to the bipartisan neocon, neoliberal principles and practices that have guided Washington policymaking since the 1990s, with disastrous results. The policymaking has included the premise that the United States is the sole indispensable superpower with a right to intervene wherever it so decides by military means and regime changes, and by using NATO as its own United Nations and rule maker. From Iraq and Libya to Ukraine and Syria, the results have been death and destruction, wars both proxy and civil, growing terrorism, failed nation building, mounting refugee crises, and a new Cold War with Russia. Trump proposes instead diplomacy, he calls it deals, towards forming partnerships, including with Russia, rethinking the rightful mission of NATO, Europe taking political and financial responsibility for its own crises, as in Ukraine, and a smaller American military footprint in the world. In effect, a less missionary and militarized American national security policy. Trump may be calling on an older Republican foreign policy tradition, an anti-war tradition excoriated as isolationism by pro-war Democrats. Trump is emerging as a realist in two respects. In reality, the world is no longer unipolar, pivoting around Washington, and the United States must share and balance power with other great powers, from Europe to Russia to China, instead of trying to destroy their influence, as the Obama administration is. But the orthodox bipartisan establishment, Republican and Democrat alike, have reacted with horror to Trump's anti-war proposals. The neocon War Party have said that they will leave the Republicans and support Mrs. Clinton, a proven warmonger. It's possible that this existential confrontation might lead, if the mainstream media were doing its job, to the public debate over U.S. foreign policy that has been missing for 20 years, and certainly up to now during the 2016 presidential campaign. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's anti-war statements are part of their popularity. Remember that the anti-war movement in the U.S. was crucial to Obama's election both times, in 2008 and 2012, against McCain and against Romney. And Obama betrayed it both times by expanding the wars. Today, the Obama administration continues to bomb and assassinate people around the world and manages largely to distract Americans from what they're doing. Obama's real accomplishment as president has been to hide American war-making from the American people. Most Americans don't realize that President Obama has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than President Bush, and is today sending U.S. troops into no less than 3/4 of the countries in the world. There are more than 70,000 of these U.S. Special Operation Forces, and they report only to the President's National Security Council. Their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Meanwhile, the president's continuing drone assassinations, the New York Times says he chooses the targets himself, have already killed thousands, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. In addition to conducting wars throughout the Mideast, the Obama administration is acting with belligerence towards China and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, which has already killed more people than Israel killed, with U.S. permission, in Gaza in 2014. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, the Islamic State, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, but America's worldwide violence is creating terrorists, not defeating them. Worse, the U.S. is today covertly cooperating with those terrorists, the people who committed 9/11, notably in Syria. The U.S. created modern jihadism 40 years ago, during the Carter administration, when the U.S. collected the most fanatic Islamist fighters it could find and sent them into Afghanistan before the Russians sent troops there, specifically to frighten the Russians, as today in Ukraine, and, quote, give the Soviets a Vietnam of their own, in the words of President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Under CIA's Operation Cyclone from 1979 to 1989, the United States and Saudi Arabia provided $40 billion worth of financial aid and weapons to almost 100,000 mujahideen and Afghan Arabs from 40 Muslim countries through Pakistan's ISI to go into Afghanistan. One of the people involved in that American subversion of Afghanistan was the young Osama bin Laden, whose organization, that's what Al-Qaeda means, would perpetrate the 9/11 attacks. Although control of Mideast energy resources was the real reason, the Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people with a propagandistic excuse that they were fighting terrorism. But what, after all, is terrorism? There are, in fact, official definitions in U.S. and British law and in U.S. Army manuals, all about the same. Terrorism is defined as, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear, close quote. In other words, the military operations themselves of the Bush and Obama administrations fall under the definition of terrorism. In fact, state-directed international terrorism in the technical sense of U.S. and British law. But when the U.S. government and media refer to terrorism, we all know that they mean terrorism practiced by foreigners against us, not the terrorism, often more extreme, practiced by the U.S. and its clients against others, particularly in the Mideast. So it becomes clear that Noam Chomsky is correct when he says, everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's really an easy way: stop participating in it. He's pointed out that Obama's secret drone program is the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. 40 years ago, the U.S. government withdrew from an illegal war because Americans demanded it. By 1969, polls showed that 70% of the U.S. population regarded the war in Vietnam not as a mistake, but as, quote, fundamentally wrong and immoral, close quote. As in Southeast Asia then, so now in Southwest Asia, the U.S. must end its criminal war. We must demand that President Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, 3, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases around the world, no other country has more than 12, 4, end the provocations of Russia and Ukraine and China in the South China Sea, 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy and stop sending them money and weapons. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, and their clients to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war making this week, but you won't hear much of it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zoe.
I want to mention a few hotspots around the globe that look as if they could develop into armed conflict, and mention some news of wars and rumors of wars and situations that are subject to increased conflict, including lethal conflict, and ask what our view should be of this and what we can do about it. A few people are marching on Washington, not particularly on war and peace issues, it appears, but the problem of the developing oligarchy, the plutocracy that many say, and Bernie Sanders in particular say, have taken over this country, and how can we resist that? Get Citizens United overturned and kind of return to the country to some kind of semblance of democracy or a popular republic in the way that Jefferson and others envisioned it long ago. So what has happened is that the very rich have in effect taken over the policy-making arm of the government, the Congress in particular. One indication was in the local daily as long ago as February of this year. It's interesting to see this because the local daily is notoriously right-wing in most of its judgments, often called what is it? Kind of graceless and mean-spirited, I think is the term that's most often used to describe their editorials. Feathers in their nests, 34 GOP hawks have received a combination of $10 million in defense contractor donations over the course of their careers. By Richard Lardner, Associated Press writer. House Republicans urging a steep increase in the Pentagon's budget have received $10 million in campaign contributions over the course of their congressional careers from defense contractors that would benefit from higher levels of military spending. The 34 GOP lawmakers, all members of the House Armed Services Committee, are pressing for an $18 billion increase in the 2017 budget year, which begins October 1st. The push is rooted in their position that the U.S. military has atrophied severely on President Barack Obama's watch, leading America's allies as well as adversaries to question the country's will. So it's time for another triumph of the will. The bid also reflects the message GOP presidential candidates have hammered relentlessly on the campaign trail where Obama has been cast as a feckless commander-in-chief. Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, last week unveiled his blueprint for a Reagan-style military buildup to reverse the damage he said has been done during Obama's 2 terms. Cruz didn't say exactly what his plan would cost. Critics of boosting the Defense Department's budget by billions of dollars say Obama hasn't gutted the armed forces. Instead of pressing for more money, they said lawmakers should be focused on cutting wasteful programs, trimming bloated bureaucracy, and forcing the Pentagon to manage its money properly. So everyone else is getting lectured on the need to do more with less, but not the Pentagon. So it's an interesting imbalance there. The Government Accountability Office has identified several areas of the department has high risk when it comes to waste and fraud, including weapons purchases and financial management. It's a jarring verdict, considering that the military accounts for half of all U.S. government's discretionary spending. Quote, Republicans claim that throwing more money at the education department won't make our kids smarter. said David Williams, president of the Nonprofit Taxpayers Association, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. If that's the case, then throwing more money at the Pentagon won't make us any safer. Claude Chaffin, a spokesman for the Armed Services Committee, said the interests of contributors played no role in the members' recommendation. He said that the $18 billion increase is aimed at filling crucial gaps in the $583 billion defense budget Obama submitted to Congress earlier this month. He said it's based on the amount the Defense Department said last year would be needed to keep America safe. And since then, the world did not get $18 billion safer, Chaffin said. So, committee's chairman, Mac Thornberry of Texas, topped the list of recipients with $941,700 in contributions made by employees and political action committees sponsored by companies that do business with the Defense Department, according to the Associated Press review of data compiled by the political money tracking website OpenSecret.com, and so on. So it's one reason it would seem that we're unable to get beyond the constant cries of it's a dangerous world. Our military is withering away, and we need to spend more and more money on armaments, throwing more and more billions at the Pentagon. And why I suspect we're getting this propaganda campaign coming on strong on public radio and public broadcasting system, that there's a terrible developing need to update and replace our current atomic submarines, long-range heavy bombers, and atomic arsenal at the total cost over a period of time of about $1 trillion. Now, $1 trillion is 1,000 billion, each billion being 1,000 million, and yet we're hearing that, we can't spend that money on human welfare, on health and education, and so on. We can't spend any more money on that because we just don't have it. We're broke, and we're in deficit, and those people will have to do more and less with less, and we can't support that. There's a local version of this and an Illinois version and so on. We just can't spend that much money. Illinois is bankrupt, and those people will have to make do somehow without that kind of help. So there's a growing chorus of this around the world, more war cries, threats of violence and so on, more provocations. The latest one is Netanyahu, the premier of Israel, taking a seat in the open with his members of his cabinet in the Golan, commonly called the Golan Heights, and announcing that it would forever be a part of Israel. Israel has annexed it, was declaring sovereignty over it. This is the 500 square mile plateau that was taken from Syria in the 1967 war. And Bibi's justification is that Syria was not using it properly. It's been turned into a kind of paradise since Israel took it over those years ago. And Israel needs it to defend itself. And so we're hearing another version of Israel has a right to defend itself. We never hear whether Syria has a right to defend itself, or whether the Islamic State, ISIS or ISIL, has a right to defend itself. So more and more no-bid and cost-plus contracts are being offered by the Pentagon. Israel is demanding more and more subsidies for their weapons program, which is in a way kind of deceptive, because most of the money that goes to them is specified that it must be spent on armaments, and those are armaments that they must or very probably will buy from U.S. armaments makers. So that's where the amount of money spent on munitions and armaments comes into play. More conflict and claims in the South China Sea. It appears that the Philippines are being recruited to be our proxy in the coming conflicts with China down there. China is now getting into the power projection game, has not only bought or leased a station near Darwin, Australia, but another one in Djibouti, way over here on the corner of Africa, right next to the American base that's been there for a good bit of years. And this says something horrible about Chinese aggressiveness, but of course the American base there has no characterization of that kind. So on and on it goes. You must accept that it is the inherent divine, God-given natural right of the USA to rule the world, to dominate everything on this planet. And if you don't accept that, then they have all kinds of bad words for you. Some currently popular ones are isolationist, idealist, utopian, and those are some of the nicer ones. Radical, and terms you can use to sneer at these people who are trying to tamp down these global conflicts and prevent the next war. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. Which are you, Ron? Isolationist, idealist, or utopian? I'll get dibs on utopian. How about that? And we'll let Karen be the isolationist?
Yeah,
No, I'll be the isolationist. You're watching Aware on the Air.
I'm sort of utopian, I guess.
Okay.
I've long been fascinated with utopian communities and thought.
Okay.
Socialists are usually referred to as utopians, so
Yeah,
I'll take on that veil. Okay, first I'm going to brief a little bit of Peter Lee's article, printed in China Matters, and then it's reprinted again in Counterpunch. And this is from yesterday, so it's pretty up to date. And he's referring to Ash Carter, who is our Secretary of Defense, and his recent speech at the Council for Foreign Relations, in which case he refers to, he's on a mission, okay, Ashton Carter. And that's to convince Asia's democracies that Asian security is synonymous with American leadership. Unfortunately for him, the two concepts are not theoretically or even empirically identical, as is revealed by a major clanger Secretary Carter dropped during the speech, during the Q&A. He said that the PRC was screwing things up in the South China Sea, thereby promoting militarization and insecurity in a region that has had it good for 70 years. Now, I like Peter's statement here, insert sound of needles scratching across vinyl. This is so, egregious a statement. He says, so this is a region that had it good by experiencing the Vietnam War, the devastation of Laos, and the horror of Pol Pot in Cambodia as a result of the doomed U.S. escapade in Indochina. And then he says, we can also throw in and I don't know this word, Lagniappe or something?
Lagniappe.
Lagniappe, okay, what is that?
Hush puppy.
Yes.
All right. The 1979 China-Vietnamese War, which was greenlit by President Carter in order to cut the Soviet-friendly communist victors of Vietnam down to size. Now, I wasn't aware that the U.S. had a hand in that, so we'll come back to that to discuss it a little more thoroughly another time, okay, while I move on. But I think that's very interesting, and as I said, I do want to come back to that. Now, Here, I'm not going through the whole article. I recommend Counterpunch or China Matters for any, it's really, really worthwhile. But it's very detailed. And some of the things that he refers to here is what you were just talking about, Ron, in respect to Carter providing a lengthy list of the good stuff that the U.S. is now bringing to Asia. He says, not only are we increasing the number of U.S. military personnel in the region, part of some 365,000 assigned to the Asia Pacific today, but also sending and stationing some of our most advanced capabilities there. And this list is very long. He says this includes F-22 and F-35 stealth fighter jets, P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft, continuous deployments of B-2 and B-52 strategic bombers, and also our newest surface warfare ships like the amphibious assault ship USS America, and all three of our newest class of stealth destroyers, the DDG-1000, which will all be home-ported with the Pacific Fleet. And all the while, we're bringing America's regional force posture into the 21st century by rotating American personnel into new and more places like Northern Australia and new sites in the Philippines, and modernizing our existing footprint in Japan and the Republic of Korea. So just one example of how we're making our ships' capabilities increasingly lethal is by maximizing production of the SM-6 missile, one of our most modern and capable munitions, which now has a brand new anti-ship capability. We're also investing to ensure our continued air superiority and global reach, including with over $12 billion for the new B-21 long-range strike bomber. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and it refers to, of course, you know, the two aircraft carrier groups in the West Pacific, the John Stennis and the Ronald Reagan at Fukuoka. I mean, it's enough to make you really ill. I mean, really, really ill, and actually really afraid. But I want to mention something else that I think needs to be stated in regards to our so-called allies. First of all, we've had a presence in the Philippines for a very long time, a military presence, even though we've only had what I call a veneer of legitimacy recently approved by the Philippine judicial courts. But nonetheless, we had Filipinos demanding accountability following the deadly U.S.-backed raid, which took place in 2014, December 2014, at which something like 44 people were killed, and a peace treaty was demolished, and this was all done by U.S., we call it assistance, all right? So, also, Vietnam, here's something I want to mention. People, all we get from the corporate-owned media, and this comes from Eric Draitser, by the way, from Stop Imperialism, something that I've been speculating on for a long time. The impression we get from much of the media is that these people in Southeast Asia, they really need U.S. help and assistance to ward off Chinese, I won't use the word aggression because it's hardly aggression, it's business that they're up to ward off their influence, okay, by using our influence, which is military and is aggressive. One of the things that Eric pointed out, and I know about Asians, how they do business, having lived in Asia for 27 years and done business with Asians. I worked for Asians. I lived with Asians, okay? Trust me, I know what I'm talking about. That includes the Philippines, Hong Kong, China, and most of all, Thailand, is that they will play both sides. It's in their best interest. Now, ASEAN is controlled, that's the Southeast Asian organization. It is controlled by the U.S., and they just had a meeting whereby, in California, whereby the U.S. was trying to influence our allies, and it failed significantly in that there was no contract, no agreement really came out of that. And I think this is proof of the fact that in Vietnam, yes, you have those that will be somewhat supportive of the U.S., but you still have those who are less interested, or what we would call more conservative, meaning that they're communist, more conservative regarding business, that are more supportive of China, in spite of their age-old enmities between them. The fact of the matter is, we're in a new world now. And the only fear I have is that probably the commie government in Vietnam is probably made up of oldsters, and so they may die off, and then we'll be stuck with the young ones who are more apt to be more business friendly towards the U.S. That's a possibility. But at the end of the day, they're playing off both sides. They know exactly what's happening. There was an interview on RT recently with Mahathir, the former prime minister and still very influential of Malaysia. And he was saying all of this between China and the U.S. benefits Southeast Asian nations, okay? Because we can use them as sort of buffer them, all right? And of course, the governments, the dictatorships will make sure, the ones that we're propping up, that they get as much out of it as they possibly can. This is what I've seen happen in Thailand, the new military government there. So our hope, and that's one of the things that Peter Lee brings up, and I think being Chinese, he also is very aware, the hope really is that the so-called U.S. allies in Southeast Asia, many of them are not going to go as far as the U.S. would like, hopefully. Now, we never know about Japan because we remilitarized them, and they now are have a militaristic government. Nonetheless, the people are opposed to what the Abe government has done. So other than Japan, other than perhaps Taiwan with their new U.S.-friendly government, the real hope is that the Southeast Asian nations will recognize what is happening and go against it. And I'm also hoping that the people in the Philippines who are not happy about most of any of this that is happening will go up against their government and insist that they stop. Even though we've now got, I think, how many bases do we now have there? Well, besides Clark and Subic.
Yeah, there are 5 more
Ron's been
leases.
quoting,
Five, I think, leases, something like that, yeah. Now, the real crux of what's going to happen is when the International Criminal Court makes its ruling on the South China Sea so-called hegemony, that the U.S. has actually taken the reins on behalf of the Philippines. We know the ICC is going to probably make their ruling in favor of the U.S. because they're controlled by the U.S. The question is, how is China going to react, and what are the results going to be? It's quite clear that the U.S. feels that, okay, we'll get the legalities set up, we've got all of our military there, and surely China will back down. And the real fear is that, and believe me, China will not back down, okay? China itself, and this needs to be noted, they recently now have set up, and let me read this correctly, it's called the International Maritime Judicial Center, and this is in relation to conflict resolution. This is China's pivot, meaning why does everything come from the West? Why do all the legalities, why are those being determined by West? This is Asia. Asia should be determining and making their own decisions, legal as well. So there is hope that the other nations involved in ASEAN, when they do meet with Chinese leaders, and Nepal recently, the leader of Nepal, because he was attempting to have better relationships with China, but there was a lot of pressure put on Nepal by India, so he did go ahead and meet with India first instead of going to China as he preferred to do first. But nonetheless, you can see the wavering of some of the leaders saying, look, we see what the U.S. is doing, and we're a little more comfortable with the way China is operating. So there is hope only if our Southeast Asian friends and allies stand up to U.S. hegemony, all right? Now, here's something I want to point out, too, regarding the military, is that according to 2016 statistics, China's population is 1,382 million. You compare that with France, that has less than 65 million. And China has 260 nuclear weapons, while France has 300, okay? The UK has 215, North Korea has 15. The US has 6,970 nuclear weapons. And right now, our scientists at Livermore are working on making these nuclear weapons or nuclear bombs to target. They'll be smaller, they'll be swifter, and they will be able to target, which means more horrendous warfare. So I think when we talk about building up our military, I mean, how much is that? 7,000 US as opposed to 260 Chinese military weapons. Given the populations that they represent,
Hey, we feel threatened
absurdity.
and unsafe, right?
our feeling threatened really is economic, and we know it.
Yeah.
But the only way we can deal with it, I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like the bully on the playground, you know? He's got, you know, one baseball, and the other guys have several baseballs, so he has to go in and start beating them all up with a baseball bat to steal their baseballs, because at the end of the day, he doesn't really want to play because he knows he can't win. That's the only suggestion I can come up with. So we're living in very dark, very frightening times. Counterpunch itself had not one, but 3 articles that I read yesterday. One was by Andrei Vilcek, the other was by Peter Lee, the third, I can't remember his name right now, but all 3 were talking about the potential for nuclear war and the devastation and how frightening it all is. I think that's very telling.
Fact check. I thought that the USA and Israel had refused to submit to the International Criminal Court.
That's right.
I have no idea. Oh, I'm sorry. They're not signed on to the International Criminal Court. No. USA, I don't know about Israel, but the USA has never signed on, ever, because we know we're guilty of so many crimes. So it's really rather ironic so that's why they have to use the Philippines as a proxy to take China to the International Criminal Court. China's not involved with that either, but it's ironic because all of the lawyers that are involved in this are Washington, D.C. lawyers.
Yeah. And American dominance of the Philippines goes back to 1898.
Right.
Actually.
Well, we colonized them. I've been to the cemetery and seen a lot of the tombstones of the Filipino dead there, and what was shocking to my daughter and I at the time was that it wasn't the Spanish that had killed them, it was the Americans. Yeah.
Yes, we forget sometimes the Philippine War that the United States conducted after the Spanish-American War in order to reduce the Philippines. Philippines didn't particularly like the idea of being ruled by the Americans after they'd been ruled by the Spanish,
Right.
and they fought against it. And the U.S. Suppression of the Philippine insurrection was particularly brutal. Historians see it as a connection, in a way, a continuity of the Indian Wars in the U.S. And the Vietnam War in the mid-20th century. That what the U.S. was doing here was following its general and consistent policy of controlling Asia. That everything from the open door policy down to through the unpleasantness with Japan down to the present, Vietnam and so forth, has been about the United States wanting to ensure that it controls Asia, Eurasia, to the extent that there is no competing power that can arise there, nor other powers that can control the economy of Eurasia in a way that damages the profits of the American 1%. That may be the most long-standing principle of American foreign policy, even more long-standing indeed than control of Mideast oil, because it runs back, as I say, into the end of the 19th century, and the announcement of it was the brutal suppression of the Philippine insurrection. Mark Twain was very much involved with the Anti-Imperialist League that was aghast at what the United States was doing, what the United States government was doing, and the fact that it was little known in the United States. What Twain was trying to do in the 1890s is make that, and his associates obviously, make that known to Americans. When the Philippines fell into the Americans' lap as a result of the war with Spain, President McKinley said, well, we really should occupy the Philippines and Christianize them. no one had, it's not clear whether no one had mentioned to him that the Spanish had brought Catholicism
Right.
to the, or whether McKinley just assumed Catholicism wasn't Christianity anyhow, and therefore, the task was still to do. But the excuse, Christianizing the Filipinos, usually at the end of what was the weapon they used, a krog? It was a particular American weapon. The economic and political motives were clear to a very few, such as Twain and his associates. But it's absolutely in line with the consistent American policy from the 19th century, from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 21st.
Yeah, William James was a part of that group also, and several lesser-known figures.
Let's just say, having lived in the Philippines for 2 years, and while there's a lot of wealth there, and I was surrounded by luxury, and my lifestyle was fairly nice, at the same time, it was rather shocking when I went there to see that the poverty there amongst the people was so much greater than anything I had seen in either Thailand or anywhere else in Southeast Asia. I mean, I can't compare it to Cambodia at the time, or because they were just recovered, or Laos, because they had just recovered from wars. But that was in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Well, there was a period there after World War II when the Philippines got interested in throwing the Americans out, or reducing American
They did.
influence.
Yeah,
Anyway,
they did.
But now it's been coming back in the past 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
With the, for a while there, Subic Bay was closed down. It's a major
Right.
American naval
Nin-
base in the
19
Philippines.
yeah,
And
19
Clark Air Force Base was also huge, but it was eliminated by the eruption of Mount Pinatubo a number of years ago. And
Well, they did. They kicked us out, literally.
yeah.
It's right here. Yeah, they kicked us out, the U.S. military, out of
And,
Clark and Subic. Yeah.
This comes up time and time again when there are big American bases, is the local people get upset with all of the gambling, prostitution, drug taking, and so on that these bases seem to be surrounded by very quickly.
Yeah, but-
it's happened again in Okinawa, for example.
Yeah, but I think, but Ron, don't focus on that so much, because the local poor people surrounding the bases, which are not right there in the heart of the city, believe me, they're located pretty far out. They will be upset about that. But I can tell you that most of the uprising against our bases is by people who actually recognize that, one, a U.S. military base in their country, not only does it bring about a lot of corruption to the governments, okay? Our presence corrupts their governments. And number two, and like I said, what happened, we're not supposed to have had a military base there in 2014, but look at what happened. I mean, it was really devastating because they had a peace treaty about to be signed, and we made sure that the peace was broken, okay? Yeah. And people were killed. Also in Thailand, 1976, that is when the Thais kicked U.S. Military bases out, okay? And that was also when the people rose up against our presence. It also makes those nations a target from other enemies. So it's much bigger than just the complaints we hear in the corporate media about, the corruption, the gambling, the prostitution dens. That exists. People don't like it, but that is not the main reason why people go against our military base presence. The protesters are protesting because they recognize what it really means. It means involving them in our proxy wars one way or another. So I really have to emphasize that.
You also both mentioned the Obama program, the $1 trillion program to renew nuclear weapons. That's something else that just quite remarkably has disappeared from the national consciousness and the news media at the end of the Obama administration. This is Obama's legacy.
Yes.
$1 trillion worth of nuclear weapons. And understand what they're talking about there is renewing the nuclear weapons of the United States to make them more usable. The whole point is to develop smaller and more efficient nuclear weapons that actually could be used in battlefield connections.
What are called tactical nuclear weapons.
Exactly. The notion is that after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people realized just how devastating those weapons were, and that there was a nuclear standoff between the U.S. and the USSR for 2 generations. Well, that misrepresents, I think, rather strongly what actually happened in terms of the use of nuclear weapons, but it does mention the principle that the idea was that they were so terrible that they couldn't be used. Now, what the Obama program tries to do is undercut that. Make them, as it were, in a sense, less terrible, not devastating quite so large an area, and making them more usable. This is the contribution of the Peace Prize president. And those issues are not unconnected, as a matter of fact. It's argued that the reason that Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize as he became president, before he really had done anything, was in fact his announced intention to eliminate nuclear weapons. That was what indeed he said as he came into office, and the Nobel Prize Committee looked at that and said, this has to be encouraged. We have to deal with the fact that the new American president is addressing the most severe threat of the peace in the world. Well, yes, he was, but not quite the way the Nobel Prize Committee thought. And after 8 years of Obama, we find what the truth of the matter was.
So this is all due to the personal influence of Barack Obama and not to the Pentagon?
No, it's combined. It's a combination. It's the
I don't
White
think
House.
there's a distinction.
There isn't, because yes, he may be a rubber stamp, but he is rubber stamping it. Everything that is put before him by his White House advisors, which comprises the Pentagon as well as the Council on Foreign Relations. Why is Ashton Carter trying to appeal to the Council on Foreign Relations regarding his need for, further money for military weapons? Because of the influence, they represent the influence of the corporations out there. So it's a combination. But yeah, Carl, what you're referring to, I was actually thrilled. I was new back to the U.S. It was late 2010. And I thought, wow, here we go. He was going on to the disarmament treaty, disarming nuclear weapons. And he and Russia, he and Putin met, and they had an agreement to disarm. And I thought, there we go. That's perfect. The U.S. we're going to set the example. We're going to start it out.
Exactly.
Because if we don't do it, we can't expect other people to disarm. I mean, look what happened to Gaddafi when Libya refused to go nuclear. I mean, in today's world, if you're not a nuclear nation, you're in jeopardy of being attacked by the U.S. to take over your resources.
The late Alexander Coburn used to say that every country should be issued 1 nuclear weapon to use in defense against the United States.
I mean, preferably, we want to eliminate the bombs.
Well, yes.
Preferably, and that's why I was so excited with Obama at the start, or in late 2010. But then at the same time, that's when he came in and he introduced Obamacare, which clearly he was, giving up on single payer. And so I thought, well, something's really going on here. But look what he has done militarily. What is the word you use? You fake right and you go, or you fake left and you go right.
Politics.
Because that's exactly what he's been doing. And while maybe believe me, he's not a king. He's not the one making all the decisions, but he's rubber stamping them. And basically, it's our whole government administration with corporations, all of them making these decisions, and he's going along with it. And nobody has to allow themselves to be a puppet regime. He's loving it. And he'll probably go and work for one of these great think tanks when he retires, and go on speeches around the country and make millions. So yeah, it's isn't that what Clinton did?
There's a note. Yes, the Clintons did very well that way.
Right.
There was a note today that the plans for the Obama Presidential Library on the south side of Chicago will be more than twice as expensive as the Clinton Presidential Library, and that may indeed finally the complex may indeed top $1 billion to build this complex on the south side of Chicago.
Well, I hope Chicago people, especially the teachers, rise up against that.
Well, exactly. Maybe the money could be used, for other purposes.
Like educating our children. Sorry, I got carried away and I interrupted.
No, not at all.
Talking about
This
the
is
South.
exactly
I mean,
what the.
I mean, this is unbelievable. Really, if you think about it, the irony here, it just, everything, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse.
Well,
I
there's
don't
an
know.
important point, I think, in terms of the current presidential campaign, in that there is this residual, unstated anti-war sentiment in the U.S. That is constantly a worry to our national leaders who want to use the military prowess of the U.S. to maintain the profits of the 1% around the world. If you can't convince Americans that they are in danger and that they need to go to war someplace, it's hard to keep the war establishment going.
Right.
Senator Vandenberg's advice to Harry Truman at the end of the Second World War that he had to scare hell out of the American people in order to keep the war production, the war preparation from the Second World War up now that the war was over. And the Obama administration has been very good at doing that. That is, hiding what the U.S. is doing while it expands the military activity of the country against the sentiment of the country, which is against the war. Obama draws an anti-war sentiment in order to get elected in 2008. He ran specifically against Bush's war in Iraq. And we know how that turned out. And he ran against McCain's belligerence in 2012. So Obama knows perfectly well what he had to do in order to get elected.
Right.
That is, mobilize that anti-war sentiment, which he did do. But his actions, up to and including the nuclear reset, have been all in the opposite direction. And how that turns out is brought to us by the News Gazette that Ron was being unpleasant about a moment ago. The News
Rightfully
Gazette,
so.
The News Gazette tells us this morning, if you look hard enough, News Gazette tells us in a 3-inch piece on the last page of the first section, U.S. is sending more troops and helicopters to Iraq. Obama, who claims that he's ended 2 wars, in fact is expanding the war in Iraq. After all, there are nasty people out there we have to fight, and they are expanding the drone strikes in Afghanistan. So once again, you used the basketball metaphor before, Karen. I think that's right.
It's yours.
Obama's genius has always been to fake left and drive right. It gets him the Peace Prize, and then he redoes nukes. He claims to have ended the wars because he knows that the American sentiment is against those wars, and yet expands the wars, in fact, in the policies of in the war policy of his administration. Hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, it's been said.
Right.
And the vicious American war policy needs to masquerade itself. And it's that masquerade that this present administration has been particularly good at over against the vicious honesty of the Bush administration, honesty in the sense of what it was going to do, certainly not honesty on what it saw in the world. But the lies of the Bush administration about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, for example, were straightforward as opposed to the much more sophisticated obfuscation of the Obama administration of the American war policy.
Yeah, I think one of the things we need to continue to iterate here is that we should recognize that relying upon just an election and getting the right person in the position and then we can just walk away is very foolhardy, because that one person can't do anything. The only people who have any real control is us, the people, forcing our leaders to do right. I mean, what you pointed out, Carl, and it's true, is that Nixon, not a liberal by any means, but he implemented some of the most liberal policies that the nation has ever known. But that's because the people made him do it. So.
Yeah, that's true. It was the early 70s was the high point, the culmination of the arc of social reform in America, amelioration of extreme capitalism in America that began with the New Deal, began with the Great Depression in the 1930s and lasted down to the 1970s. What we're coming to realize now is that we're at the end of another 40-year period in which reaction set in, not by accident, but
Right.
because basically the American business community decided it had to get control of the American economy, and then one of the ways to do that was via war, via the defense industries and so forth. And what we got was the economic program that generally goes by the name of neoliberalism, a way of using government power to restore the profits of business and to reduce the social supports such as Social Security and Medicare and things of that sort that came out of the New Deal. So that's the reason that the equivocal figure of Richard Nixon stands at the end of that arc that begins with Roosevelt, that begins with the New Deal, and starts off the arc that begins now and ends with Mrs. Clinton, perhaps. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a couple of minutes left. You have a concluding comment, ladies and gentlemen?
No, I'll just mention again, I prefer to avoid, if possible, in influencing the government, barricades, bonfires, and blood in the streets. And I hope we can avoid that. But you're leaving me with very little hope in that respect.
There's no hope. There is no hope.
There's
On the other hand, blood, think about it this way, you know, weapons aren't going to solve the problem either because the kind of weapons our U.S. government has. I mean, we look like pioneers with pitchforks, but we have to get out there. I mean, Martin Luther King, he followed the most pragmatic and successful movement as far as civil disobedience. So I'm hoping the people, and we have this happening all around the country, but it's not united yet, and of course it gets no corporate media coverage. So.
Yeah, another possible hope is that neoliberalism, as it's now called, is ultimately self-defeating, I think. Its program tends to erode and dissolve all other institutions, including eventually itself.
But its self-defeat means also the defeat of many others and the harm to an awful lot of others too.
Exactly.
The people indeed who were aided by the social democracy that existed in America from the 1930s to the 1970s. So.
Yeah.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 16th week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. The Washington Post, not a radical publication, estimated this week or summarized the figures that it had this week to say that police in America had killed 990 people in the course of the last calendar year. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware, where we'll post a couple of these articles, particularly from Counterpunch that have been mentioned tonight. Our friends at Counterpunch are publishing, I think, the most distinguished list of political comments that you can find on the web. Finding Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.